Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for introducing yourself in the chat. I'm Cindy Peck. I'm the co-director for the Center for the Advancement of Reading and Writing, and I'm also the director of the ERWC program. And I'm so excited to welcome all of you for a wonderful webinar today with Dr. Ginny Crisco and Dr. Glen McClish. And so our topic of the day is rhetorical affordances, recasting texts for new learning. I'm so excited to learn and hear from them. And before we get started, I wanted to go over a quick few slides with all of you. We can turn to our ERWC slides. So for those of you who aren't familiar, we have a social media presence and we have an X account at CSU_ERWC. You could follow us on Instagram at CSU_ERWC. You can also, if you have any questions at any time throughout the year, please feel free to email us at erwc@calstate.edu. And then we also have Facebook presence at CSU Expository Reading and Writing Curriculum. And then, of course, we also have a blog, https / at erwc blog on our ERWC website. So if you Google ERWC online, you'll see it'll take you to our ERWC community online, and we have all kinds of resources on that website. So our next slide, please. So please don't forget to follow us. And so we also have, if you go to our website, which is the blue link at the bottom, you will be able to see our upcoming workshops for the year. And we have this year, we started our 2-day intensives workshops. So please make sure that you look at those topics. Some of them are in person, but most of them will be online. Don't forget to register for that. And Kia did a wonderful job color coding them so they are in blue, so you can identify that the 4-day workshops are in green and then the 2-day workshops are in blue. Okay. And any other kind of information, please feel free to click on the link below that says writing.csussuccess.org. Okay, next. Also, I wanted to just let all of you know that there is a CATE conference taking place this February 28th through March 2nd at the Hyatt Regency in San Francisco. Please visit this website and note that it's going to be a wonderful conference. We will have a ERWC strand at this conference, so please join us there. Next slide. And of course, we have our annual ERWC conference as well, taking place in June 23rd, 2025. It'll be at the Long Beach Marriott, and more information will be provided to you. We have secured our keynote speaker. It's going to be Tay Keller, and we are also going to be providing information about our newly piloted module, middle school modules that have been piloted and are being evaluated. So please don't forget to join us. Please, once we share this flyer, feel free to share them widely. And so with that said, I'm going to turn it over to our Miss Deborah Robinson. I want to thank her for securing our webinar speakers and our presenters. And I want to thank Kia in the CARD W department for all of her work putting all of this together. So I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cindy. As Cindy mentioned earlier, today's webinar features two what I like to call homegrown presenters that come straight to us from the California State University system. Dr. Virginia, or Ginny, as most of us know her by, Crisco, comes to us from Fresno State, where she teaches literacy and composition pedagogy. And Dr. Glen McClish comes from CSU San Diego, where he is currently chair of the Department of Rhetoric and Writing Studies. Both presenters are actively involved in the development and promotion of ERWC as module writers, workshop facilitators, and members of the ERWC Steering Committee. So please join me in welcoming them home. Welcome, Ginny and Glen. Thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you, Deborah. I'll make sure our slides are visible. Can you see the slides? Excellent. Okay, so we just have our name and contact information here. I'm going to go ahead and start this afternoon, and then Ginny is going to take the second half. We're mindful that we have a lot of material, so we're going to try to go quickly. We have a little bit of opportunity for folks to weigh in the chat. We'll try to move so we get through our program in the allotted time. I'm going to begin, and then she'll pick up afterwards. So our purpose this afternoon is threefold. We would like to help you to identify the rhetorical affordances, or I call them pedagogical opportunities, of the text you teach. And related, we'd like you to reimagine the power of rhetorical strategies and concepts, such as antithesis, paradox, and survivance, within our ERWC reading to writing arc. So we want to stress today that strategies are not merely aesthetic objects or a demonstration that one has reached a certain kind of discourse prowess, but in fact are essential tools of persuasion. And in fact, they often define the argument. Many times, a particular strategy is the essence of the argument. So we want to emphasize today, as a takeaway, that when you identify key strategies and understand them, they often have the power to actually deliver an argument. And the third outcome, our third purpose, is to reinforce this notion that literature is a kind of rhetoric, not a complement or a competitor, but actually a kind of rhetoric. I think we're trained, and our educations encourage us to see rhetoric as primarily civic and literature as primarily aesthetic. This goes way back in our educations. But really, literature should be seen as a kind of rhetoric. And this really clarifies the teaching of all kinds of texts. We have selected texts today that represent historically oppressed and disregarded people deliberately, because we want to show that strategy is inherent in all kinds of rhetoric, including those who have been marginalized. So I want to start with the strategy of antithesis. Antithesis is that strategy in which rhetorics create either or dichotomies or binaries. It's a strategy that allows us to say this or that, to make decisions and to simplify those decisions into usually two categories. The rhetorical scholar Ginny argues that antithesis is created when two parallel phrases or clauses feature words that an audience would recognize as opposites. Antithesis often appears in arguments when the rhetor wants to draw stark contrasts. So helping students to identify antitheses, whether they construct sophisticated differences or simplistic, exaggerated, false dilemmas, is a highly transferable skill that strengthens both with and against the grain reading and also composition. It's a really fundamental skill to be able to identify these and, when appropriate, to use them. As a mentor text, I want to look first at Malcolm X's famous antithesis in The Ballot or the Bullet, his 1964 speech. Kind of definitive version of the speech was delivered in Detroit in April of 1964. And Malcolm X's purpose is to create a clear distinction between the civil rights, the rights that African Americans deserved, and the result of not getting them, which would be violence, the ballot or the bullet. And he really sets up this dichotomy as a decision, a choice that the culture will make, and then will have to bear the consequences of. So he wants to really clarify for both his African-American audience and those white listeners or readers of his speech that there's a choice to be made. It's either or. And so this alliterative phrase becomes the essence of his argument. Here's a piece from the speech. I'd like you to take a minute to read it, and then we'll say a few words about it. So here Malcolm X creates a stark distinction. It's either our liberties or it's violence. And in doing so, he hooks his argument to the American Revolution and to those famous words, liberty or death, that a white man composed. He links himself to that argument, to the American project, and he shows that the antithesis that is essentially American continues from white to black, and that the very kind of lines that white Americans drew, white privileged American men drew, are still true. You don't have a revolution in which you love your enemy. This is the same struggle, he suggests, and he uses that tool of the white rhetor hundreds of years later to make a similar kind of argument. Very powerful. Audre Lorde in The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House also relies heavily on antithesis. In this 1979 speech, she wants to suggest that the kind of generative differences between white and black women should not be papered over or tolerated or in some ways de-emphasized, but need to come out, need to be emphasized. And so she wants to bring forward this antithesis between white ways of knowing and black ways of knowing. And to do this, she uses antithesis. This is just a little piece from the speech. Go ahead and read it to yourself. Think about Lord's language here. Difference must not be merely tolerated, but seen as a fund of necessary polarities between which our creativity can spark like a dialectic. So she's trying to suggest that these differences are not to be covered up, but to be emphasized, that this either or this difference is going to create inspiration, creativity, a dialectic, two warring positions, two battering positions, which will then create something better, potentially a synthesis later. Lorde doesn't want to run from difference. She wants to embrace difference. In this speech by Martin Luther King, 1968, his final speech before his assassination in Memphis, Tennessee, when King is trying to rally the supporters of the sanitation workers' strike, King uses antithesis in a very interesting way. He uses it to recast or reframe an either or. And this can be a very powerful move for both the rhetoric our students read and the rhetoric our students produce, when you can basically recast, reform an antithesis. Here's a bit from the text. King argues here, it is not a choice between war and peace, violence and nonviolence. It's a choice between nonviolence or non-existence. This notion that with the mutually assured destruction, the nuclear power of the world, if we have violence, we'll have non-existence. Only nonviolence will bring us on its continued existence as a species. It's nonviolence or non-existence. He recasts the former idea of war and peace to a different binary. Very powerful. So thinking about the RWS arc, reading to writing, what kinds of arguments could students write in which antithesis is their central rhetorical strategy? And what are the particular affordances of antitheses that emphasize either or differences or reframe situations? These are two questions that I just want you to consider, and I don't want to take extra time away from Ginny, but these are questions which I'd like you to think about as you think about your own teaching and your students within either ERWC classrooms or any classroom. How can they integrate antithesis into their work in a mindful and powerful way. Talk quickly about paradox. In contrast with antithesis, paradox is a strategy that integrates, that synthesizes, that brings together opposites and resolves contradictions. Looking again at Jeannie Fonstock's book, she provides the definition of paradox. On its face, the paradoxical proposition is deliberately self-contradicting. The speaker maintains a contradiction, knowing that the audience will perceive it as such, and then goes on to solve it. So apparent contradiction, which is solved. And there's a real art to paradox, almost a kind of mystical quality that has this kairotic feel when one brings together apparent discrepancies or differences in a unified kind of way. And I would argue this is a very transferable skill for analysis and invention. A few examples. Let's go back to King's I've Been to the Mountaintop. King begins his speech by saying that if God allowed him to live any place in history, any time in history, he would choose the present. He would choose to be in Memphis at this time when this sanitation strike is not going well, when the civil rights movement has stalled, when he and many people are feeling anxious and depressed about the movement. King says, I want to be here and now. And these two paragraphs, I think, really speak to his, whoops, I'm gonna go back. Excuse me. To this text. Take a minute to read these two paragraphs. So King makes his choice to live in the present, which is strange, he says, because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick, trouble is in the land. And yet he knows that when it's dark enough, you see stars. Trouble brings enlightenment, brings clarity, brings lucidity. And so things are bad enough that he can see what's going on. He can understand that this time, this particular time, something is happening positive, people are being moved. And these two paragraphs, especially the second one, really encapsulates the entire speech. This paradox is the rhetorical essence of the entire argument. If you buy his case, then his audience will continue to support the movement, the sanitation workers, and the nonviolent movement in general to see civil rights struggle move forward. This is the essence of his argument, paradox. I would also argue that paradox is extremely important in Audre Lorde's The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action, 1977, an MLA talk. And here, Lorde, in contrast to the text we talked about earlier, she wants to bring together disparate thinking, a variety of people. She wants to bring them together into the feminist movement. She wants to enable people to work together. Here are two important paragraphs in which you see paradox moving. So in this first paragraph, Lorde is talking about her cancer diagnosis, her initial cancer treatment, and the kind of terror that brought her, and the danger as she faced death. And she argues that despite difference, all these women from all these different walks of life, backgrounds, life experiences came together to help her. And they brought her initial survival. She learned that she was not only a casualty, but a warrior. So we bring together two opposites, casualty, victim versus warrior, and she links them together in this paragraph. More to the point, I think, in the second paragraph, she talks about surviving in the mouth of this dragon we call America. Black women have to first learn the most vital lesson, that they were never meant to survive. So survival is based on knowing that survival wasn't meant for them. Clear paradox. Understanding to survive is to know that they weren't meant to survive. And then furthermore, the very visibility which makes all women vulnerable is the source of their greatest strength. So this vulnerability is where strength comes in. And in these paradoxes comes the kind of urgency of her speech to encourage working together, bridging difference, finding union, whether it's in cancer treatments or it's in literature syllabi, wherever it is. She's calling for a kind of liberty through this transformation of silence, this working together, this collective consciousness. Very powerful, and it has this almost mystic power that paradox brings. So thinking about our arc again, two questions to consider as you meditate on this talk. What kind of arguments could students compose in which paradox functions as their central rhetorical strategy? And what are the particular affordances of paradox? And having raced through the slides, I'd like to move to Ginny's portion of the presentation, and I will call up her first slide.
Awesome. Thank you, Glenn. So I'm also going to talk about affordances of texts. And I think when Glenn and I were first talking about this presentation, we kind of wanted to draw on texts that were already in the curriculum that maybe teachers have taught multiple times, and maybe giving folks some new ways of entering into those texts. And so kind of reinvigorating texts that had been around in the curriculum for a while. And so for me, one of the things that I've been working with a lot with teachers, both at the secondary and at the college level, is this idea that I got from Jennifer Fletcher's book, Teaching Arguments, about the notion of audience as more than just one thing, but as primary, secondary, and tertiary audience. And so you can see on this image that I have here that these she includes in her book these circles, and is a way of helping students to think about, well, who's the primary audience for this, who's the secondary, and who's the tertiary. And that helps students to get out of that kind of thing of like, I'm just writing this for everybody, or anybody, anybody who will read it is who I'm writing it to. But I think it's also, particularly in thinking about lesson design and helping students to think more deeply about rhetoric, that we can apply this notion of, primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences to literary texts. And so the first text that I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about two texts today. One is How to Write a Poem in a Time of War by Joy Harjo, and that one is in the Poetry for the People module in the 11th grade. And then I'm also going to talk about How to Tame a Wild Tongue by Gloria Anzaldúa, and I'm going to be looking at those in a couple of different ways. So Harjo's poem, and if you can go to the next slide, please. She's an indigenous writer, and so I wanted to kind of map onto these two texts these concepts that I'm pulling from rhetoric studies that help us to think about the ways that these authors are using that are thinking about audience rhetorically. So in Indigenous studies and in rhetoric and writing, they talk about this notion of survivance. And this is not just a concept that's in rhetoric and writing studies, and it's not just a rhetorical concept. But Malia Powell, in her article, Rhetorics of Survivance, How American Indians Use Writing, uses survivance in rhetorical ways, but she actually draws from Gerald Visner, who is also an Indigenous scholar, where he theorizes this idea of rhetorical of survivance. And so I thought I really wanted to pull in her notion of survivance because I think it helps us to see audience in a variety of different ways. And so she argues for the concepts of survivance as an example of how American Indigenous writers address audience. And it's at a very basic level, it's this idea of survival plus resistance. And it's a rhetorical strategy that American Indian writers have used, quote, in order to reimagine and literally refigure the Indian. And so in that regard, survivance is really about Indigenous rhetoric, and it's not necessarily about any other rhetoric from other writers of color, because it is kind of very specific to the situation of Indigenous people in the United States, but maybe across the world as well. Okay, next slide, please. And so one of the ways to kind of consider this and to flesh it out a little bit more, and these are really more questions for teachers, how do the authors reimagine and refigure the Indian? How do authors imagine a new tribal presence in the very ruins of representation of invented Indians? How do the authors consciously and selectively interpret with a specific audience's needs in mind? And how do authors use resistance as a powerful and humanizing form of rhetorical expression? And so the first three questions are come out of the article from Malia Powell, but the last one is from a scholar. Her name is Sarah Klotz, and she's actually her article Impossible Rhetorics of Survivance at the Carlisle Indian School is actually applied to students. Of course, these are students in the late 19th century, but they're applied to students and thinking about how they use survivance in their writing. And so the next slide, please. So I'm going to take a couple of excerpts from Joy Harjo's poem, How to Write a Poem in a Time of War. You can click on that QR code if you want to go there. I was going to try to show it to you very quickly, but we were having a little bit of technical difficulties, so I won't be able to do that. But it is also, so that QR code will take you to the Poetry Foundation where you can find her poem. It's relatively, it's a medium-sized poem, but it is also published in her book, An American Sunrise. And what I'll say about that poem is it is a poem about war. It's about loss in relationship to war. It's also about colonization. There's sort of a kind of historical historical feel, while there's also a kind of feeling of presence that kind of coexist in the poem. And there's some really interesting cultural elements as well that come in, as well as kind of in relation to institutional elements that, as a kind of contrast that you find in this poem. And so it's a really interesting poem to think about this concept of survivance. And so I have just a couple of excerpts that I wanted to share with you to kind of flesh out this idea of survivance. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in this excerpt, she's saying, we tried to pretend war wasn't going to happen, though they began building their houses all around us and demanding more. They started teaching our children their God story, a story in which we'd always be slaves. No, not here. You can't begin here. This is memory shredded because it is impossible to hold by words, even poetry. And so you can see here that there are this notion of survivance. And in fact, if you have some observations about the ways that she might be engaging in this concept of survivance, I'd like to invite you to share those in the chat. Because even though I have some ideas that I'm going to share with you, I also want to try to engage my audience and see what other folks are kind of thinking about, to see how you're understanding this notion of survivance by looking at this. So maybe we can just take a minute for you to, post something in the chat. What do you think is happening here in relationship to survivance? How do you see this author using multiple audiences, primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences, if that can help? Okay, well, if you have some ideas and you're pulling your thoughts together, please share them. So one of the things that I see going on here is that she starts off with this idea of we. And so she is invoking a kind of indigenous audience, right? Like, we tried to pretend war wasn't happening. She's writing to other indigenous people, their experiences of war. And then she's also kind of positioning against this notion of they began building their houses. So there is this kind of indigeneity experience, indigenous experience, but then there's also a kind of colonialism where people are coming in and they're taking over. And so in some ways she's gathering people, but then she's also challenging this tension that's being created between us and them. um, and then goes on, they started teaching our children their God story, a story in which we'd always be slaves. And so again, she's talking to this indigenous audience, but she's also challenging any other audiences that might be part of that colonial experience where, they are the dominant perspective, they have the dominant religion, where they represent certain people in certain ways that are not powerful. And then the last piece of this is the italicized. And throughout the poem, and again, if you saw the whole poem, you'd have a better sense of this, but throughout the poem, there are these italicized elements where it's almost like she's, talking to her muse, or it's like, it's a little bit more about the process, right? How to write a poem in a time of war. This is where the italicized piece really comes in. Like, is this the best place to start? Is this where we really start to make sense of all this? Is this where people can really understand this and buy in, or do we need to start somewhere else? And so there is this kind of running commentary with this kind of outside conversation, this outside muse, if you will, to think about, like, what about the timing? What about the things that I say and how they're said? Um, uh, so Yes, thank you, Marilyn, for your participation. Definitely disparity between white culture and Native American, and the clash of those cultures and values, human dignity. Thank you. Um, okay, if we can go to the next excerpt. And this one is a little bit later in the poem. He knew one day, far day, the grandchildren would return generations later, over slick highways, constructed over old trails, through walls of laws meant to hamper or destroy, over the libraries of the ancestors in the winds, born in stones. His song brings us to his home place in these smoky hills. Begin here. And I think actually this is an excerpt from the very end of the poem. But what struck me about this particular element is that, again, there is that kind of cultural knowledge versus the colonial domination, right? You have the slick highways constructed over old trails. So there's this kind of history, there's a kind of legacy, there is a kind of, the grandchildren, invoking the grandchildren and generations later versus the walls of the laws that are meant to hamper and destroy, and the libraries, right? The texts that dominate in in these institutional settings, right? And it ends with this idea, again, a kind of cultural idea. His song brings us to his home place in these smoky hills. And so there is a kind of cultural representation, a cultural recognition, while also challenging those kinds of dominant colonialist ideas, institutional domination, institutional power dynamics. And then again, we get the muse at the very end, begin here, right? Begin with the songs, with the generations, with the culture. And so, yes, thank you. Generations are being built over, and yeah, memory shredded, right? Is this clarified later? Um, it is a little bit clarified later. I mean, it's never really totally clear, but it is, there are other moments throughout the poem where she includes these italicized elements juxtaposed with other kinds of experiences of war and those kinds of things. And so I definitely encourage you to check out the whole poem. I wish I could spend more time on it. And thank you for people who are participating. Please keep your comments coming, because I think it just really adds to our collective experience of what this is and how we can define this. But I did want to go on to the next slide. And so in thinking about how we can approach this with our students, I wanted to kind of leave this section with this idea of primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences in relationship to survivance. Like, is this a way that we can help students to recognize the multiple layers of audience, not only that they can see in the text the literary text that they're reading, but also as their own opportunities as writers, right? To assert themselves as being present while also challenging those dominant power structures. And how can the purpose of survivance be an affordance for students? And so these are some questions that I will leave you with, and continue to move forward in the next slide. Yeah. So the other example I wanted to bring to you is really something that's happening more at the language level. And I wanted to bring this in because we are doing so much work right now with ELD. And I felt like it was really important for us to look rhetorically at the language level, to see what scholars are doing or to what writers are doing, as a way, again, of looking at those rhetorical affordances, but also supporting our students. And so while you might see some good relationships between survivance and counter story, I did not want to apply the notion of survivance to a Latinx text, because again, I think survivance is a concept that is specific to indigenous literatures. I have not seen it applied to other writers of color. And so I'm pulling on the concept of counter story, which is really a genre that comes out of critical race theory. But I'm drawing on the work of Aja Martinez. And her article is, give me one second to find the article. A plea for critical race theory, counter story, stock story versus counter story dialogues concerning Alejandra's fit in the academy. And so you can find this article. It's in our works cited too, but you can find this article for free on the WAC Clearinghouse, WAC Clearinghouse. But she defines counter story there, and counter story is a genre that has been around for a little while. It's what they say started critical race theory and legal studies, but she's brought it into rhetoric and writing studies, and has written a book about it, and has started to think about it in rhetorical ways, like how is it working rhetorically. So she defines counter story as recognizing that the experiential and embodied knowledge of people of color is legitimate and critical to understanding racism that is often well disguised in the rhetoric of normalized structures and structural values and practices. And then she draws on Robert A. Williams Jr. to kind of talk about this notion of audience. So these stories help us imagine the outside in America, a place where some of us have never been and some of us have always been, and where a few of us shapeshift like the trickster, asking the hard questions without answers, questions about what it means to be outside, what it means to be inside, and what it means to be in between in America. And so even though I started this with this notion of like primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences, it's fairly linear. And I think that's helpful for students to kind of understand these different layers. But really, when we're looking at these literary texts, the audience piece is not linear, right? It's emerging in different places. There's an emphasis in some places and and a de-emphasis in other places. And you can go from one line to another and find these different emphases of audience. And so that's what I kind of wanted to share with you as we move through this. So next slide, please. So thinking about these questions that we might be able to bring to students, or as we might be able to look at texts that we're going to be prepared to teach, and we might ask ourselves, like, who do the authors address? How do the authors address outsiders? How do they address insiders? And how do the authors engage the shift shaper, right? How do they move back and forth in between? And so I wanted to share with you in the next slide an example of code meshing that really illustrates this, I think, well. And this is from the text How to Tame a Wild Tongue by Gloria Anzaldúa in her book Borderlands, La Frontera. Um, and this book is fairly old. It's been around for a long time, but the work that's being done here is really difficult to find all together in one place. And so, so I bring this to you because I wanted to kind of share what I see going on here as far as how is she using affordances of audience by code meshing, right? And so code meshing is the integration of other languages into multiple languages in one sentence. And so the first bullet, and I'm just going to look at the first couple sentences. So, en boca cerrada no entran moscas. Flies don't enter a closed mouth is a saying I kept hearing when I was a child. Ser habladora was to be a gossip and a liar, to talk too much. Muchachitas bien criadas, well-bred girls don't answer back. So in these first three sentences or so, she's translating. She's doing a direct translation. And so the assumption here is that she's pushing on this idea of like academic writing as only in English, as only in standardized edited American English. But, so she's incorporating Spanish elements, but she's translating because she's assuming that at least part of her audience is an English-speaking audience that maybe does not know any Spanish at all. And so this is one of the ways that this is one of her audiences that she is invoking. And so then the next section, es una falta de respeto to talk back to one's mother or father. I remember one of the sins I'd recite to the priest in the confession box a few times I went to confession, talking back to my mother, hablar para atrás, repelar, hocicona, repelona, chismosa, having a big mouth, questioning, carrying tales, are all signs of being malcriada. In my culture, they are all words that are derogatory if applied to women. I've never heard them applied to men. And so you see in the second section that she's actually like es una falta de respeto. She's not directly translating this. She is asking us as strong readers to pay attention to the context of the sentence so that we can understand what's being said by paying attention to the context of the sentence. Later on, so she's saying it's a problem of respect, right, to talk back to your mother or father. And then later on, the hocicona, repelona, chismosa, there's translation there, are all signs of being malcriada. So again, another place where she's saying to us as readers, you have to understand this in the context of the sentence. And if you don't, I mean, again, trying to invoke different audiences, right? And And so hoping that, you know, that there are those audience members that can do that translation, or that you can understand that translation from the context of the sentence. And then the last bullet is a place where she absolutely invokes a different audience. She says, even our own people, other Spanish speakers, nos quieren poner candados en la boca. They would hold us back with their bags of reglas de academia. And so here, if you don't speak Spanish, what she's saying is that they want to put locks on our own people, our own academic Spanish-speaking academics want to put locks on our mouths, and they want us to, you know, they want to hold us back with their bag of rules, right? And so this is another completely different audience, even though these are all academics, right? But these are Spanish-speaking academics, and she's specifically invoking these particular audience members. And so, so this is another kind of counter story, challenging these ideas of what is acceptable in academia, what is acceptable language to use, who, you know, and again, who are the people that you are writing to, and how can you push on those people in different ways in order to get your message across and make it clear that there's something else out there that maybe you're not familiar with, and that maybe you should be familiar with, and those kinds of things. And so next slide. And this is my last slide, but just wanted to get and to kind of end with this idea of questions that maybe teachers can use to think about bringing texts in that represent counter story, or represent these primary, secondary, and tertiary audiences, that demonstrate to students ways to use code meshing in a text. And also thinking about the affordances that that different texts can bring in, not necessarily as a kind of linear primary, secondary, and tertiary, although that can be helpful, but also the way that these different audiences can kind of move into and out of a writer's purview, their point of view, and help us to see things in different ways, and then provide students with opportunities to recognize the complexity of audience, and how they might be able to engage an audience as writers. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and I'll look through the chat and see the interesting comments. And yeah, I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
Lois Clark asks if the information could be presented at future ERDBC conferences. I think that's a great idea. So we'd be delighted to do these talks in a more extended way in June. That would be a lot of fun, I think. And then just because it's face to face, we have more opportunity for true discussion. So that would be great.
Yeah, code meshing is often it's sort of a new way of thinking about how people move into and out of the use of dialects and other languages. So, for example, April Baker Bell talks about code meshing in her book, Linguistic Justice. But this is something that linguists have been talking about. Vershawn Ashanti Young also talks about code meshing in his book. But the idea is, it's similar to, I mean, you would say like somebody speaking Spanglish is code meshing. Or somebody who is speaking Black English might be using elements of Black English and might be using other elements of standardized English. And so it's really a mixing of, you know, different it's not really, it's dialects or languages. It's in kind of in relationship to code switching, which is what we used to call that, the integration of different languages, but actually the definitions have kind of evolved over the last, I would say, maybe 20 years or so, 15 years. And now code switching has a kind of negative element to it, which is it used to be invoked in this idea of like, okay, we're writing teachers, so we'll let students write in their own language. And then you need to translate it in order to, make it for your real audience, right? And so that was a kind of code switching where, it was okay for students to write in informal ways in their own language, but when it came to presenting it for a grade or those kinds of things, they needed to code switch completely, change their language to a more standardized academic edited American English. And so I don't know if that's kind of a quick overview, but does that answer your question? I hope so.
Yeah, I think that helped answer the question. So informative,
Also
Dr.
wanted to, if I
Crisco.
could, respond to Jennifer's comment about antithesis as a gateway to other kinds of competencies, such as similarities and differences, compare and contrast. I think that the kind of thinking that takes place when you think about it, and this is really that similar kind of thinking where you're trying to develop ways in which you see difference. And difference that's important, that can be generative. Paradox, of course, shows connection that's generative. So we have a dialectic there between these two rhetorical strategies that enables students to do their own writing and their own analysis beyond merely our ERWC classes or other kinds of writing and literacy coursework as well.
And Jennifer, you have a great question there about, are there other, in addition to counter story and survivance, are there other methodologies that can help readers see texts and their own beliefs, bias, and values in new ways? I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I am sure that there are. And so I did a significant amount of research I was trying to do a lot of connecting in order to kind of bring these ideas together. But I was also looking in, not everybody in rhetoric studies theorizes audience in these ways, but it does seem to be that there are some folks that are kind of trying to think about how scholars of color are engaging an audience in ways, or writers of color are engaging an audience in different ways. And I found some of that in Jacqueline Jones Royster's book, Traces of a Stream, but she didn't really have a concept for it. And so I think she was at really maybe some of the beginning stages of that. And so some of these other scholars that are coming out with these ideas, I think I think we're going to see more of this as we move forward in working with the rhetoric of scholars, writers of color. So.
Well, thank you both, Ginny and Glen, for giving us different ways of looking at rhetoric. And I know that with all of your expertise in this particular subject, that a separate session in June during our conference would go a long way toward taking us beyond what we typically think of when we think about rhetoric. And I, for one, am very appreciative of your time and all that you've done to prepare for this session. So thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate that you all came and gave us your time.